Now, we will move to cross-examinations of the teams by each other, and we will start with about a 10-minute process, and we will start with an affirmative question for the negative.
So
I'm sorry.
Oh.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So that's okay. You can come down here and join me. We're both all over.
So you note that if we withdraw, then Afghanistan will once again become a safe haven. However, isn't NATO presence and NATO military operations in Afghanistan right now creating a stronger and more severe terrorist threat in Pakistan?
No, I think the important thing to remember is that the root cause of radicalization is poverty. After the Soviet Union left in the 80s, what we refused to do was increase humanitarian aid for Afghanistan, which meant poverty skyrocketed and there was no infrastructure in Afghanistan. What happened after that was you had a more radicalized Taliban. You laid the groundwork for international terrorism, and overall, the Taliban took over the entire country. Now, that refutes the idea that having a country occupy Afghanistan is what causes radicalization. Radicalization is caused by poverty, and as our Wolf evidence indicates, withdrawal leads to a huge humanitarian crisis, which would no doubt increase radicalization.
Question from the negative for the affirmative.
We as a negative do not believe that we need to negate all 6 tenets presented. Given this, if you had to say, what is the most important tenet according to the affirmative?
Well, I think there's not just one important tenet, but really 3 of the most important tenets. One of them was what you brought up, which is proportionality, in that the costs have to outweigh the benefits, and that we have to utilize limited means, and that we have to protect these civilians' lives. But second, we have to have a just cause in this war, because that is what the military operations after that are predicated on. If we shouldn't have been in the war in the first place, then none of the military operations that exist are justified anyways. And the third and final is that the war must be winnable. Because if we're conducting all of these violent means, then that means that we're actually sacrificing a lot. And if we can't really meet our goals at the end of that war, that means it's not justified in that we're having a lot of bloodshed without really helping the society.
Question from the affirmative for the negative.
Okay, so we brought up the definition of military operations, which specifically deals with the military movements and the use of troops and armaments in the war. So where does your humanitarian assistance really fall in the scope of the resolution, in that it doesn't actually fall within the definition of military operations?
Well, NATO in its mission, it states in its own mission statement that humanitarian aid falls underneath its goals.
Question from the negative for the affirmative.
You say yourself that.
All right. Okay. Well, given the fact that there has been increased resources and troops sent in 2010, how does any of your evidence from 2000, majority of it is from 2008, account for the current shifts that have happened in NATO's missions?
Okay. Well, part of it is that we don't just quote things from 2008. The other thing is that though there was a troop increase, it didn't change many of the underlying issues that we're talking about, such as the just cause, the just intent, the fact that there's fragmentation in NATO. None of this changed in 2010, and the troop surge probably exacerbated the situation, since that came from the majority from the United States. So that's just exacerbating the shift that we're talking about in the legitimate authority section, given that NATO is seeing that over 81% now of the troops are provided by 3 countries, and that's destroying the alliance in and of itself.
Question from the affirmative for the negative.
You said yourself that in this resolution we need to identify the justness of individual operations, but when is it ever justified to kill innocent civilians when it's otherwise avoidable?
Okay, I'll answer this question. The question is not whether or not it's justified to kill civilians. The question is where these civilian deaths are being caused by. Our evidence indicates that civilian deaths are caused primarily by the Taliban, and if the Taliban took over, this would increase significantly more. And the Taliban people recognize this as well, because 72% of them say that they support NATO operations. Afghan people support NATO operations, and 82% prefer the current government. They've recognized, and we've recognized, that in order to create the best life for Afghanistan civilians, we need NATO operations.
Question from the negative for the affirmative.
Yeah. I'm wondering, looking at post-Soviet withdrawal and looking at the fact that the lack of humanitarian aid laid the groundwork for the rise of the Taliban. I don't understand, how do you create the separation between national security and humanitarian aid when in the past the lack of humanitarian aid has caused instability in the international world?
Well, there are a few different issues in this. First of all, the rise of power of the Taliban was not simply caused by a lack of humanitarian aid, and the causes of terrorism and instability in the region also have faults in the United States or NATO nations funding, for example, the Mujahideen and funding war in countries like Afghanistan. Furthermore, just because these issues may cause problems in Afghanistan does not mean that NATO has to be the organization that takes care of them. And humanitarian aid, even if NATO defines it as falling under its scope, is not part of its original purpose and does not relate to NATO's military operations.
Okay. Thank you very much.